LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. Researchers say a new drug which has been approved to treat Alzheimer's could lead to the disease being managed like diabetes or asthma. Donanemab was found to reduce cognitive decline by up to 35%. LBC's learned the house builder Redrow is planning to close 2 of its sites in the south of England and cut staff at its head office. LBC's Henry Riley has seen the documents.
The email, which was sent to all staff and leaked to LBC, said the current economic climate was having a negative impact on the home building industry. The firm, one of the largest home builders in the UK, employs more than 2,000 people, and one employee confirmed to LBC that over 100 people could be at risk of losing their jobs.
Redrow says its current developments would remain unaffected. Opposition parties say plans to cut the number of university degrees will leave young people with less choice. The Prime Minister's plans to restrict the amount of what he calls low-value courses are being described as a cap on aspiration. Wimbledon runner-up Novak Djokovic has been fined more than £6,000. It's for smashing his racket against the net post. It'll be deducted from his second-place cheque. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 28 points at 74.06. The pound buys $1.30 and €1.16. LBC weather, showers easing for most. Rain for Northern Ireland and West Wales overnight, a low of 6. Rain moving east tomorrow. Some isolated showers in northern Scotland with a high of 24. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Cross Question. It's 1 minute past 8 on LBC. With us on the panel tonight, we have Zack Polanski, Deputy Leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Brooks Newmark, former Conservative MP and Minister who's helped to evacuate more than 30,000 civilians from Ukraine. We'll hear a little bit about that from him during the course of the hour. Alys Denby is Deputy Editor of the centre-right news commentary site CapX. And John Crace is Parliamentary sketch writer for The Guardian and author of the book A Farewell to Calm, The New Normal Survival Guide, whatever the new normal is nowadays. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you'd like to ask our panel a question. Lots to talk about tonight. Rishi Sunak's clampdown on university courses which don't generate good outcomes for students. Keir Starmer confirming Labour won't end the 2-child benefit cap. Visa rules being relaxed to make it easier for foreign tradespeople, including bricklayers and plasterers, to come and work here. And near record temperatures being recorded across many parts of the world as a new report says climate change will threaten national security and food supplies. So the number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, I hope you're watching on Global Player, because if you're not, I want to know why.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's Jack in Peckham. Hi, Jack. What would you like to ask our panel?
Yeah, well, I just want to ask, do you think that the consequences of the 2-child, benefit scheme might drive up the abortion rate, and does that trouble you?
Well, we were talking about this in the last hour, and Angela Rayner, she was quoted as saying, I'm trying to find the quote here, she said in 2020 that the obscene and inhumane 2-child cap must go, and she linked it to research which said it was a key factor contributing to women's decisions to have abortions.
Yeah.
So let's go around the table on that. Zack, let's start with you.
I think the place to start is what is the point of the Labour Party and what is the point of Keir Starmer? There are 4.2 million children living in poverty in the UK. That's 1 in 3 children. You would think that the Labour Party would be there to stand for them. But actually, at every moment from Keir Starmer standing for leader to now, he has U-turned. Whether it's on standing up for striking workers, whether it's standing up for migrants and speaking out for those on a positive story on migration, and now even on starving children, he refuses to take a line. We saw that interview this weekend. I'll refer to it as that interview because it was that atrocious, where he was talking about the difference between no hope and false hope. Is that how bad this country's politics have got right now? That we can either have 13 years of this Tory austerity, or we can have a Labour Party which is pretty much standing on the same platform. There is, of course, an alternative. That's the Green Party, and that's why I'm campaigning for more MPs and a team of MPs. But what we really need in this country right now is an opposition. The Green Party are willing to take that place when necessary, but ultimately the Labour Party, because they have more seats at the moment, they need to be speaking out. And the fact that Keir Starmer, at every opportunity, seems to want to just be Tory light is an abdication of responsibility. It's a dereliction of duty, and it's really harming our country.
Well, at least Keir Starmer asked the question that Laura Kingsbow put to him, which is more than you've done for Jack.
I think I've answered the question.
No, he's talking about will it drive up abortion rates, or has it driven up abortion rates?
Well, I think it was implicit in my answer that yes, I think it will. I think we know the huge risk that lots of vulnerable and marginalised people are in, and we know particularly that women, when they have children, when they know the consequences of having a third child that could be for any reason, then yes, I think for some people that will be an incredibly difficult decision. I think that's one factor on it, and I think the other factors I've mentioned are the larger systemic factors too. The government will say, of course, that things like rape and particular cases are exemptions within this. But I think that's such a complicated myriad of legislation when really we could just take the humanitarian route and actually just accept that children who are born through no fault of their own should not be suffering. They shouldn't be in child poverty.
So you would
we should be
have
protecting
no cap
them.
whatsoever?
I don't think there should be a cap whatsoever. I think a child that has been born should not have to suffer as a result of, or so-called result of, their parents' choices. I think ultimately we could have a conversation about education. We could have a conversation about women's empowerment. There's lots of conversations we can have, but the idea of making starving children worse off, especially when we're in a cost of living crisis, is just absolutely absurd. And I think there is no defence. And I think any Labour politician who even attempts to defend this, frankly, shame on them.
Well, we haven't got a Labour politician here to defend it, unfortunately.
They wouldn't bother anyway.
Alys Denby.
I'm slightly confused by Keir Starmer's strategy here. I've seen that Kid Starver has been trending on Twitter today. I feel like he'd be better off just, when he's so far ahead in the polls, just not saying anything, least of all adopting this, reminding people of this quite cruel Tory policy. In terms of abortion, I'm not quite convinced that people make such personal, intimate decisions based on finances. I feel the same when people talk about having tax incentives for people to have more children. I don't feel like when people are planning their family, they really have the tax man foremost in their mind. Though I totally agree that it does seem perverse to be punishing existing children through the welfare system. I feel like the original principle was to try and make people who are on welfare try to face the same kind of financial decisions when planning their family as those who are in work. But like I say, it seems cruel to me to punish children for their parents' decisions. But
part of the issue here is somebody called in the last hour and was complaining that people on 50,000, if one of the partners was earning 50,000 and the other was earning 49,000, they would still be entitled to get child benefit. And yet, if it was just a one-person household earning 50,000, they wouldn't be. And I'm thinking to myself, why are we paying benefits to people on £50,000 a year? It's madness.
Yeah, I think we would be much better to have a tax system which made it so that it was far less expensive to have children in the first place for everyone. I mean, if you look at things like the cost of childcare for people in work and with the incredibly high tax burden, it's very expensive for anyone to have children. And I do think that there's a slight perversity in the tax and welfare system that households will get benefits as a family, so both parents' income is taken into account, but you're taxed as a single unit. So at the same way at the top end, you can have two parents kind of both earning £99,000 and they will get 30 hours of free childcare, for example. And if one of them goes over the 100k mark, it's suddenly a 20 grand hit to their income. So there's lots of ways that you could make the whole tax and welfare system much fairer and better for families. And especially, at a time when we're facing demographic decline, when we need people to be having more babies, I do think that this is something we should be looking at.
OK, John Crace.
I'm sort of with Alys and Zack, really. I'm faintly bemused by Keir Starmer's objectives in pursuing this policy at the moment. Because financially, it's not that inexpensive to extend child support for more than two children.
I think it's over £1 billion.
It is over, but
It's quite a lot.
It's not that much, really, when you're kind of in government. I mean, last week, Rishi Sunak, having said that 3.5% was the most that the country could afford for public sector pay, suddenly found an extra 5 billion quid through savings or wherever for doctors, nurses, teachers. And so the 1 billion quid for, which would probably come down in a way, in the end, to a matter of 300 or 400 million. I mean, in the wider scheme of things, I don't think it's that much. So why go for a policy that Labour supporters inherently hate, and also most of his MPs disagree with?
The answer is that it shows financial rectitude, and Labour are very frightened of being portrayed as people who sort of spend money like water. That can be the only reason, surely.
Well, yeah, but it is this sort of mirroring of the Tories in every way
That's
that
what
I
Gordon
find.
Brown and Tony Blair did, didn't they, in 96, 97?
I can't believe they would have done it on this issue. This is totemic for Labour supporters.
Brooks Newmark, you were an MP when this came in, I think. Just explain the reason why it was introduced.
I argued against it, actually.
Did you?
Yeah, so I argued against it just on the same reason that's just been discussed, that the marginal cost is fairly small in a 1.3 trillion budget. And the people who get hit hardest are the poorer families. And there's a huge amount of knock-on effects with, later on when, poor families tend to struggle more, it leads to problems in education and drugs and family breakdown and everything else. So I'm from the socially compassionate end of my party, and I think it's foolish. And I think, again, you're right. While the headline figure is around $1 billion, I think the real figure is much lower, probably half of that in the end. So no, I think it's the wrong thing to do and hurts the poorest in society.
Let's pick up your point, Zack, about what's the point of Keir Starmer, because there are people. I mean, you will know from the...
So I didn't even answer your question. Your key question was, is it going to create more abortions? Is it going to create more abortions? And I don't think so. I think people's decision on abortions is very complicated, and those who make a financial decision is, again, very marginal.
Keir Starmer not taking many risks, I think, is an interesting one, because if you knock on people's doors, and I get this on the show all the time, you get somebody saying, why can't you all just get along and sort of work together for the good of the nation? And so they're quite happy when two political parties sort of kind of collide. Then there are others who say, what is the point of getting up on a Thursday morning and going out to vote when I haven't got a choice? You've got the two parties more or less saying the same thing. And you can never the twain shall meet. You can't sort of reconcile those two positions. But in the end, Keir Starmer, as well as appearing to be financially competent, has also got to inspire people, Brooks, and he's not doing that, is he? Even the polls show...
I'm not a member of the Labour Party, so it's not up for me to advise Keir Starmer. But I think you're right. I think tactically, I can imagine the conversations is just, trim your sails, stay just slightly to the left of the Tories and let the Tories screw up and lose the next election. Don't say anything that's going to frighten the horses. And so I think tactically, not that I would advise him to do it on this policy, but I can see why his policy team maybe are advising him this way.
Let's just bring in Thomas in Cambridge, who wants to have a word on this. Thomas, what would you like to say?
Hi, so I've been listening to this conversation since some time, and I heard somebody said their income is 50,000 and they're still on benefits. My question is, in this country, why don't we have a proper system where we can, where we can distribute the benefits to really, the relevant people, rather than, somebody was saying about that, and I know people who use luxury cars and they're still on benefits. And I'm not jealous at all. They have all the right to use whichever car they want. But thing is, why are these people on benefits? I think if we should have a proper system in place where we can distribute the benefits to the really needed people. I think that would serve the purpose.
Okay. Alys.
Yeah, I agree with your caller. As I said before, I would much prefer a system where we had lower taxes so people could keep more of their own money. I do think that the introduction of universal credit has been somewhat of a success. The idea that you can still work and claim benefits, it stops people being trapped in that worklessness cycle. But yes, I think we should definitely improve the whole tax and welfare system. On the point of what's the point of Keir Starmer, I think we're in the position now where it's the Tories who've lost the election rather than Labour going to win it. But I think you're right that if they're going to stay in power after the next election, they do need to have a much more inspiring vision and a reason for people to get out and vote for them again. And I think the thing about Keir Starmer is that he's shown himself to be an incredibly ruthless political operator. The way he's purged the party of the Corbynites, the way he's selected all the candidates the next election, to be in his own image. And there's nothing wrong with that. Politics is a ruthless business. But I think it raises the question of what are his principles and what are the things that are going to guide the decisions that he's going to make in the future. We know what the platform kind of that he's standing on at this election, but what about unforeseen problems that are going to come up? What are the principles that guide him? And I don't think he's shown anything like that kind of conviction.
John?
I think we've seen ruthless Keir, but I think we're now seeing timid Keir. It's almost as if, he doesn't feel he's got everything has to be Tory light at the moment. And as I said, I can't understand. This would be a defining issue. It's iconic for Labour voters. Half his shadow cabinet has decried the Tories for their two-child policy on this. And it really wouldn't be that difficult. He does need to establish some clear blue water, I think, or clear red water even, between himself and the Tories. I don't think, an election strategy on just being the man who wasn't Rishi Sunak, I don't think, it may win an election, but it won't inspire the country and it won't take us anywhere. We need to know what he stands for.
Paul says, Iain, you asked why I can't watch on Global Player. I'm driving. I will accept that as an excuse, Paul. Well done for that. Right, we'll come on to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Let me reintroduce my panel to you. We have Zack Polanski from the Green Party. He's our Deputy Leader. Brooks Newmark, former Conservative MP. Alys Denby from the news commentary site CapX. And John Crace, Parliamentary sketch writer for The Guardian. James is in air. Hello, James.
Hello again, Ian. Nice to speak to you.
Hi.
Hi. Given some of Mr Sunak's comments today in terms of university education, I wonder if the panel would like to list those undergraduate courses that they would discourage young people from studying.
Well, the government intends to restrict the number of places universities are allowed to offer for courses which do not provide, quotes, good outcomes for students' future careers. Brooks.
Yeah. I'm someone who's keen for as many people as possible to go to university and for them to make the decision on what loans they're going to end up taking on. I think that I think there's a lot of other issues to deal with, which is the fact that one of our most successful businesses is university education, and our immigration policy is doing everything possible to hamper that. I do think there are a lot of subjects I wouldn't encourage my children necessarily to take, but I think it's
like what?
It's up to them. I mean,
well,
I'm not going to.
Well, James wants you to give a list.
Yes, but I'm not going to give a list because I don't believe it. I don't support. I don't support that.
Kylie Minogue Studies apparently was a degree at some point.
And if someone wants to take on whatever, £25,000 of debt to do Kylie Minogue Studies, that's up to them. The only people who get free university education are people that I think in the bottom 15% of sort of income. So I think the majority of people end up making an economic decision. If I go to do Kylie Minogue Studies, I know at the end of it I've got a debt to pay. So therefore there must be some logic, I hope, economic logic in that decision to go and do those studies.
Okay, John Crace.
Well, I was in Parliament when Gillian Keegan was making this. She made a statement on this afternoon, and it was quite interesting that there were quite a number of Tories who clearly don't believe in this either. We had Peter Bottomley saying, what are we going to do about those with a religious vocation? I mean, vicars and imams tend to earn next to nothing, really. Are we going to just sort of get rid of them on the grounds that they aren't economically viable? They don't earn enough. And that's, and Kit Malthouse asked about philosophy and poetry. Are we going to get rid of them? Because
I'd happily say yes.
Well, I don't think, because in the end, Gillian Keegan couldn't name any courses that she would want to get rid of herself. And the government...
Well, nor can Brooks, can you?
No, because in the end, the government hasn't actually defined its own terms of what is an economically unviable course. What is a level of graduate salary that makes a course unworthwhile, and also what level of dropping out of a course, which was the other part, does a course need to reach to be ditched?
I think it's really interesting because when I was at university, there were two different schools at my university. One was called the School of Development Studies, and it was considered a bit of a joke course. The other one was Fine Arts and Music. Similarly, it was for sort of posh kids from Fulham. And yet, if you think about it, we are now described as an international development superpower. We have a world-beating cultural sector. And you think, well, the people who started those courses back in the 1970s kind of knew what they were doing.
Well, my son did creative writing at your university.
Well, there we go.
And creative writing at UEA is an incredibly top-notch, well-recognised, well-respected department, notwithstanding, actually, the cuts they're now bringing into that very department. But it is not just leading in the UK, it's internationally leading in that area.
And I studied German at university, but in my department, you could learn Swedish, Norwegian or Danish. And then in 2004, they abolished the whole languages department of the university that is nearest Scandinavia. And you think, The world's gone mad. Anyway, I mustn't get my hobby horse. Alice.
I find it's difficult to talk about this sitting here. You know, I went to university. I'm going to make an assumption that many of us did, and we've clearly all benefited from it. So I think it's quite unattractive to sit here and say that this is something that should be denied to more people. But that said, and details are clearly an issue with this policy, but I do think that Rishi Sunak is right to have identified that there are a number of courses where students will come out poorer. I think it's something like 1 in 20%, so a fifth of students end up poorer having been to university than they would have been had they not gone, and something like a third end up in non-graduate jobs 2 years after graduating. And for those people, it's clearly not good value for money. And there is a whole kind of cohort of young people who are coming out of university very disillusioned, saddled with a huge amount of debt, which, Brooks, you said that, that's their choice to take that on. But it's a huge problem for the public finances, because if they don't earn high salaries, they won't pay it back. So I think when you asked to sort of name courses, this is where you get into a much more complicated debate, because I think one of the kind of, if you look at the facts, the statistics, one of the least kind of valuable courses in terms of your future earnings is creative arts. But as you're saying, Britain is a creative arts superpower. We're really saying we don't want people to be studying art, and that everybody should study maths, which I think was what Rishi Sunak would like. So I do think this is a complicated debate, but I do think that the incentives for universities are all wrong. Tuition fees mean they get all the money up front, and all the incentives to get as many students in through the door as possible.
So you can't think of a course that you would like to see abolished?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, the creative arts is the one that has to go. But I would hate that myself. I studied art history at university, so I think,
look where you ended up.
Exactly, look at me now. So.
I mean, media studies is the one that I would, I wouldn't abolish it, but I do think that there are far too many courses offering media studies, a lot of them completely useless in terms of career progression, because I think people are led to thinking, if I study media studies, I can get into the media. Not the case.
I think you want to look at employers as well. So, I mean, for example, in journalism now, a lot of employers, a lot of the big newspapers and stuff will expect you to have an MA in journalism, when it used to be a job where you would just come up through a local paper. So employers need to look at this as well and actually make a bit more of an effort in their recruitment.
Zack.
I think
hang on a second. Let's go to Zack first.
This cuts through to the very heart of who we are as a society. Arts and culture is always the first under attack, and I think we always need to make a passionate defence of our arts and culture. Not in sort of middle-class way, although that is also important too, but actually it's a great leveller. It's a way of young people finding their voice, finding their role in society. When we look at the huge problems we have, like the climate crisis, we're going to have to find ways to tell stories, to tell narratives. We have a cost of living crisis. Cinema is a place where people can come together as a community to sit, to learn, to laugh, to be together. And I think not understanding the value of this in society and just making it about GDP or just what's economically viable completely misses the entire point of what a university is about. Now, there's been a huge marketisation of university, and that's been disastrous, and we should absolutely abolish tuition fees. But even on its own terms, if you look at it as a market force, then the customer should choose. And so the idea that this Conservative government are just going to come in and pick and choose what courses people can or cannot do is absurd. And on media studies, which often gets called the Mickey Mouse course, I believe it's worth £83 billion to the economy. It's one of our biggest exports. So I think, again, even if you look at this in economic terms, and I would say it's much broader than that, it still doesn't make any sense. This is just culture war stuff that the Conservatives have come up with to distract us from the real issues going on.
What did you study at university?
I went to drama school.
I should have guessed. John, you wanted to come back.
I've actually had a rethink, and I've thought of a course we could yes. PPE at Oxbridge. It's done us no good at all to have successive prime ministers studying that.
What did you study, Brooks?
I did history undergraduate, and I did.
I was so hoping you were going to say PPE.
No, I did. I did go to. I did go to Harvard Business School, though.
Well, there's no need to show off.
You asked me the question. I'm answering your question.
No, absolutely right.
But that brings the point, though, of that a lot of people now end up doing further education, and what I encourage the younger generation is that to do what you want to do. University, I feel, and you might say this is a rich person's benefit. University is the last time you can do something that you're truly passionate about, and I've encouraged all my children to study something that they're passionate about. And on the one end, my eldest did maths, my daughter did drama, my youngest son did creative writing, my second son did history. I mean, they've all done different things, and I think it's the last time you can do it. Then you have to work for the rest of your sodding life, you know.
Scott says film studies, get rid of that. Why would you want to get rid of film studies, particularly when, again, this country is a leading sort of creator of very successful films? We have film studios that are some of the world's best. Bizarre. And then someone, I think Thomas is being a bit naughty here. He says, doesn't Global Radio offer a media studies course? Not quite. It's the Global Academy, which is basically a secondary school that has a sort of media specialisation. But it's not
there is a
quite
good
the
point
same.
there about apprenticeships as well, that university will not be for everyone, and I think that's fine, but about making sure that people have other opportunities. And I think it's ultimately about creating variety and not trying to pit people against each other.
But I think the reason why that never happens is because people, dare I say, like us, sitting here with degrees, technical education was great, but not for my kids.
Right.
So
I couldn't agree more. I mean, listening to the MPs this afternoon and going on about sort of how bricklaying was a great course and welding, and you just knew that they would be horrified if it was their own children doing it.
I did bricklaying.
So this
You always surprise
I've
us.
actually seen you lay bricks, haven't
That's
I?
right.
In
That's
Rwanda.
right. In Rwanda, yeah. I did a bricklaying course in Bedford Tech College or something like that.
Well, fair play to you.
But we are going to need thousands of people to do things like retrofitting. There's a huge retrofitting skills gap. So I think it's about removing the stigma from people doing work with their hands and also paying them properly and making sure they're good unionised green jobs.
Yeah, and also I think apprenticeships have fallen by about 57% in the last 13 years.
Have they?
Yeah,
I thought
because
it was
that
quite
was
the reverse.
that was a statistic brought out in their debate this afternoon.
Well, we have a Secretary of State for Education who herself was an apprentice. I think that's the first, so hopefully that can be reversed. Right, more questions to come. Thank you, James, for yours. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30 on LBC News Headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
A new drug has been hailed a turning point in the fight against Alzheimer's. Donanemab was found to slow clinical decline by up to 35%, meaning people with the disease could still perform day-to-day tasks. LBC's learned more than 100 jobs are at risk at Redrow. Emails and documents show the house builder is planning to close 2 of its sites in the south of England. Redrow says its current developments would be unaffected. And opposition parties say plans to cut the number of university degrees will leave young people with less choice. Rishi Sunak's plans to restrict what he considers low-value courses are being described as a cap on aspiration. LBC weather, showers easing for most this evening, but persisting in the far north. Rain for Northern Ireland and Western Wales overnight, with a low of 6.
LBC
Action.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Zack Polanski is here, Deputy Leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. You've been doing that for about a year now?
Yeah, exactly, or 10 months.
What's the best thing about it and what's the worst thing about it?
Best thing easily is going around the country, visiting local parties. People go, here's a community project I've been doing.
In an environmentally friendly way, of course.
Yeah, I get the train everywhere. Worst part of it, I think, is the amount of meetings that you have, and I'm not complaining about it, but you just asked me what the worst part is, and that's the honest answer.
John Crace is Parliamentary sketch writer for The Guardian. Is the worst part of your job, John, knowing that you've got to deliver something amusing by the end of the day?
It's absolutely terrifying. Every day, it never gets better, Ian.
Because I've often fancied doing your job, but because I think I can be funny, but I wouldn't want to have to be funny every day.
Yeah, and you can only work with the material that you're given as well.
And Brooks is out of Parliament now, so you can't even have a go at him.
No.
Brooks Newmark is here, former Conservative MP and Minister. What do you miss most about being an MP?
If I'm honest...
Or miss least?
What I miss most, it was a great platform. If you care about issues, and I still encourage people, if they want to be MPs, to do that. And you know, if you do have the letters MP after your name and you do care about things, it does enable you to do a lot of good things. I don't know, I enjoyed the campaigning, I enjoyed the constituency work. I think what I would find more difficult now, whereas that wasn't the case in 2015, is the horrible social media attacks against MPs, and particularly female MPs. I just think that some of the language that I see is sort of well out of order. And so I think if I was there now, 8-9 years later, I think I would, I'd find the social media side particularly very toxic.
Alys Denby is Deputy Editor of the centre-right news commentary site CapX. Just tell us a bit more about CapX if people don't know it.
Yeah, so CapX, we're part of the Centre for Policy Studies. I think of us as the kind of the magazine of the Centre for Policy Studies. So
the tabloidy bit.
The tabloidy bit, yeah. Well, what I think we do is we turn kind of proper policy work, proper kind of wonky, dense stuff into something much more engaging and easy to read. And we have a daily email to which I recommend everyone subscribes. We have quite a lot of policy analysis, but broader kind of comment from a centre-right perspective. It's been a great time to be on the centre-right, as you can imagine.
Right, let's go to our next caller. It's Hassan in Westminster. Hassan, very good evening.
Good evening. We have extreme weather conditions happening across the globe, whether it's heat waves or flooding. And we have our political leaders who, according to James Goldsmith, the Prime Minister is just not interested.
Zack Goldsmith.
And we have, Zack Goldsmith. And we have Keir Starmer, who hates tree huggers and has delayed the Green Deal of his by another 2.5 years. So since we have only this one planet to live on, what should we be doing?
I'm not going to come to you first, Zack. Alys.
Teasing.
Oh, thanks. I was just... it's funny that the kind of green environmental guys are all called Zack.
We're very different, though.
He's got a K on the end of his name.
I suppose this extreme weather we're having in Europe is quite scary. It obviously makes all the things that scientists have been warning about feel very real. Though I would say that I think there is a difference between weather and climate change. I think the thing is that climate change is going to make these kind of extreme events more common and more persistent. It's certainly worrying. It makes me think that we need to be, as well as reducing our emissions, doing a lot more to mitigate the impact of climate change. So in Britain, in London, when we had 40-degree heat, no building has air conditioning. We're just not set up for it at all. So I think we need to be reducing our emissions, of course, and also thinking much harder about how we're going to adapt, because we are going to be living with these consequences.
Can I suggest that if we have 40-degree heat again this summer, that everyone comes and sits in this studio? Because whenever I walk in at 7 o'clock, it is so freezing, I cannot tell you. Zack.
When Keir Starmer was challenged about this recently, his first answer was, I'm on the side of economic growth. And I think that points not just at Keir Starmer, but the entire problem. It's about GDP. And in fact, the guy who came up with the idea of GDP has said that is a terrible way to measure things. We can talk about growth, but what about growth of mental health, growth of well-being, growth of community cohesion, growth of dealing with things like the gender pay gap, the disability pay gap, the race pay gap? And I think the solutions here are quite clear. It's to insulate every home in Britain that needs it. It's to do deep retrofitting. It's about investing in active travel and public transport. Now, the immediate question is, how are you going to pay for all of that? Now, I know that Keir Starmer initially said £28 billion. Now, even that was not nearly enough. In fact, the Green Party have costed £100 billion a year for 10 years, which, yes, is £1 trillion. But actually, we know the ways to get there through things like a wealth tax. We know that if we just taxed the wealthiest 1% of their income, and I think it should be more, but even on the most basic Conservative estimate, you're looking at around £75 billion a year. Then there's carbon taxes, the very simple principle that the polluter pays. Now, in the past, when we've talked about the climate emergency, people often feel like it's something very distant and it's in a long time away. And actually, it's been happening for a long time, particularly in places like the Horn of Africa, where places are now almost uninhabitable because of the heat. Just in London last year, we saw more wildfires than we've ever seen. And in fact, the London Fire Brigade had its worst day in terms of call-outs since World War II. We're seeing these increasing effects. And you're absolutely right. Weather is not the climate, but the climate emergency is creating these extreme events that we're going to see more and more. It's time to adapt. It's time to mitigate. But more than anything, I just think of that moment at COP26 where Alok Sharma, to give him credit, he cried. He was in tears. It was someone who cared about the climate. And when I look at our national leadership, whether it's from the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, there's a complete absence on the stage of people who really get this stuff. Sure, they talk about it in a tick-boxing kind of way, but people who understand that the climate has to be at the heart of everything, because ultimately, tackling the climate emergency is also about tackling the cost of living crisis too. Because if you insulate homes, that brings bills down and also creates energy efficiency.
Does it make you hanker for David Cameron? Because he actually got this, didn't he?
Well, he talked famously about cutting the green crap. And actually, if we'd invested in 2015 in renewables and onshore wind, then actually we'd be in a much better place than we are right now. So I want to be dignified and gracious to Prime Ministers gone by, but I think David Cameron is just as much of a problem as all the rest of them.
What did you make of Keir Starmer's comment about hating tree huggers?
I thought it was bizarre. I mean, we come straight back to the point of what is the point of Keir Starmer.
We're assuming he actually did say it, but it was briefed out of shadow cabinet,
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely. I mean, I think the thing to say on that is I've spent the day today with Mayor Jamie Driscoll and Neil Lawson and various other MPs across parties. And someone talked to me about how all political projects end up in a bunker. Eventually, when you've been in power for a long time, you just have a small group. But this is Keir Starmer before he's even in power. If his tent is not even big enough that it can't even contain people in his own party who care about the environment, who care about the climate, then I think that's indicative of where the Labour Party are at. And I know the Conservative Party are much, much worse. And I can hear people saying, why are you not criticising the government? We know the government are awful. They're out of touch. They're out of ideas. And they're out of time. We know they're a dead government walking. And actually, it's time for a Labour government, it looks like. But that Labour government...
So you'll be standing down all the Green candidates?
Well, no, I don't. I'm not calling for a Labour government, but it's time in terms of the natural sway of things. Absolutely not calling for that.
But it is notable, I mean, you've just sort of triggered this, that you have criticised Labour on this show so far, and we're 42 minutes in, more than you have the Conservatives.
Well, it's exactly that. I think the Conservative Party are clearly on their way out. They don't even look like they're trying anymore. Look at the London mayoral election. They don't even seem to be putting up a credible candidate or even challenging Sadiq Khan. But that doesn't mean the Labour Party should get a free ticket on these things. And this is the problem with first past the post. It looks like it's their time because we have this pendulum that swings from blue to red. But the problem is the pendulum is swinging less and less. And actually the two parties are looking more and more like the same party.
Brooks.
Well, I guess first I want to make a couple of comments on what Zack was saying. The thing with your idea of the wealth tax, and this is always what the left say, is unfortunately the 1% of the most mobile people around. So if taxes, and we already have probably some of the highest taxes in 50 or 60 years at the moment, if you actually aggregate everything. So, I don't think taxation is necessarily the route. Where I have a problem is, for example, John Kerry lecturing the Chinese on, trying to cut carbon emissions. The biggest polluter in the world today is the United States. And the thing I would stop is carbon trading, because what that allows is the polluter, i.e. the United States, to go to poorer countries, and I'll take Rwanda as an example because I spent a lot of time there, is that
not forcibly. We should
no,
say.
not forcibly. No. I've been there.
You haven't been
15 years. I've been going. I have a school there and a teacher training centre. One of the things the government has done there is to be incredibly green. So what the United States would do, for example, they would go to Rwanda, who has effectively a carbon credit, and they would trade their polluting side and effectively pay in an invisible way to take on, for example, Rwanda's carbon credit. So I think carbon credit is a way to control globally. I understand the concept, but what it allows is rich polluters to keep polluting.
Do you agree with that, Zack?
No, so can I briefly challenge this idea of capital flight? So we often hear this from people who aren't on the left, where they say if you tax people, they will leave. There's no actual evidence for this. And I always think that if someone doesn't want to contribute to this society and they don't recognise that their taxes pay for our education system, it helps their business to make sure that their employees are safe. It invests in making sure their healthcare are right. If they don't want to invest in that, is that really the people we want in society? No, I'm talking about the super rich here. I'm not talking about the small community business.
The answer is yes.
If you're talking about the 1%,
yes.
Or if you're talking about the 0.1%, people might have more sympathy. But the top 1%, I think, includes people who are on 75,000 a year.
Correct.
Now, some people might think that is a definition of richness. I personally wouldn't.
Again, I think it's about people at the very top being disproportionate.
Do you regard 75,000 a year as being very rich?
Yes, I do. And I also think that if you look since 1988, just 100 companies have caused 80% of the carbon emissions around the world. So it's very clear that this is not about everyone's problem. It's not about individual responsibility. I'm vegan. I don't fly. I don't drive a car. But none of those things are really the point. The point here is that the super rich and a very small amount of companies are taking up everyone else's carbon emissions. And a redistribution of both wealth, but also making sure that the polluter pays is absolutely vital if we're going to tackle the climate emergency.
I think the real problem is the kind of short-termism of most governments. Most governments operate on a 5-year basis, and their immediate goal is to be re-elected. And, whether we like it or not, the Greens haven't been as effective enough as they should be at putting climate high enough up the agenda, I think.
I challenge that.
Well,
why do you say that? Because that's mostly what they talk about.
Yeah, but it hasn't got through to Rishi Sunak, for instance. He does. You won't hear the government making any kind of green pronouncement. He could barely be bothered to go to COP this year, could he? And
see, that's why Zack misses Boris.
Well, I think the Green Party just had the most successful local election results ever, and in fact the Labour Party went up 10% in relative gains, the Green Party went up 56% in relative gains. I know you're talking about national politics,
very low number,
but not really, in fact. And I think that's the problem with the first past the post system, that proportional representation, as we see around
Europe. Let's not get onto that.
Well, it's important. PR klaxon.
Right, it's 8:46.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Zack, Polanski, Brooks Newmark, Alys Denby and John Crace here answering your questions. Here's a text question from Barry in Plaistow. If we're going to let brickies and roofers come to the UK freely again and drive down wages for those trades, what was the point of voting for Brexit? Now, this is because visa restrictions for tradespeople, including bricklayers, masons, roofers, roof tilers, slaters, carpenters, joiners and plasterers, have been relaxed, along with rules for those in the fishing industry. The government has denied claims that this move hurts its efforts to cut immigration. Alys?
I think this is one of those problems where it comes down to the fact that there were two very different visions of Brexit. There was the global Britain, let's open up to the world, let's take in all immigrants, and then there was the fortress Britain, let's shut down and let's be far more protectionist. And I think what we're finding now is that actually we do rely very heavily on immigration, and this vision for a kind of high wage economy where British people were going to do all these jobs that they didn't want to do doesn't seem to be materialising. For the government, this does seem to be a massive headache, since Rishi Sunak has seemed to stake quite a lot of capital on tackling illegal immigration and with reducing the overall numbers of legal migration, when in fact it's the highest it's ever been. I just think people will listen to, successive Conservative governments saying they're going to bring down overall numbers and see where the numbers are going and never believe a word they say.
Isn't the point, though, that we now do have control of who comes into this country, which we didn't before? We did for the rest of the world, but not from the EU. And if we are short in a lot of these trades, certainly in the short term, it makes total sense to allow more people to come in.
Of course it makes sense, but people were also promised that overall numbers of immigrants were going to come down, and that's patently not happening.
Not by me, they weren't. In that campaign, I said, anyone that votes Brexit and thinks that immigration will reduce, you're going to be very disappointed.
I think people heard what they wanted to hear during that campaign, and that was the problem.
Zack?
I think people were repeatedly lied to. I think another point, though, I've been out campaigning with an organisation called United Voices of the World. They describe themselves as a union for low-paid black and brown migrant workers. I've been speaking to these workers, most days, and they're not just talking about pay, they're talking about dignity, respect, equality. And I think this is all part of a toxic debate that has again been fuelled both by the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, in which migrants' contribution to society has not just not been valued, it's not been celebrated. We need positive stories about migration. This isn't about wage suppression. We're again straight back to the point about the very wealthy in the society, that actually if we taxed people properly, we wouldn't be in this zero-sum game. And I think very often the government love to pit one marginalised group against another marginalised group. Essentially, we should recognise that when we've got 120,000 vacancies in the NHS, of course we should also be growing British talent, but ultimately when there are gaps, we're going to need migration. And we shouldn't just need it for an economic reason, for humanitarian arguments as well for migration, that our country could be a welcoming, generous, inclusive country, and we should all be proud of that.
But do you take the point, though, that if you have control over your borders, I mean, people have a hollow laugh at that, given the amount of people that do seem to be coming to this country without permission, but if you have control of your borders in theory, you can change the regulations to meet the demands of particular sectors in the short term, and then maybe strengthen them after a few years when there are no longer the shortages.
Well, again, I think we need to reject the frame, because ultimately that's about saying people are just there to almost be human resources. Now, I know that's, again, an economic argument, but I think migrants bring so much more to our society than that. They bring culture, they bring different traditions.
Well, I agree with that, but you unless you believe in open borders and allowing everyone to come here that wants to come here, there's got to be some system to regulate it.
Well, I think where people want regulation is the fact that we have such a lack of infrastructure. So where tensions are created around things like enough adequate housing to make sure that there's GP appointments, that people can get to a dentist. And I understand people's fears about that. And that's why we start to hear scare stories about migration. But ultimately, the migrants aren't the issue. The issue are 13 years of austerity and underdevelopment and not investing in those vital public services.
John?
I like Zack, I think a lot of people heard what they wanted to believe. I don't think Brexit was a thought-out policy. I mean, I can remember on the day after the referendum going to the Vote Leave press conference where Michael Gove and Boris Johnson were supposed to be giving us their vision of success. And they both looked like terrified rabbits, that they were expected to deliver on something that they had no idea. And it's still playing out today. I mean, not just in migration, but in terms of we're now being expected to sort of be jubilant about signing a deal for the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal that is projected to make 0.08% boost to GDP. We'll need 50 of those to get back to the 4% that we'd lost on by leaving the EU anyway. I mean, it was a kind of...
Because you're starting to sound like the BBC now on that.
Oh, good.
Brooks?
I guess, I'm going to split the two arguments there. On Brexit, I was part of one camp on pro-Brexit, which was, having been in Parliament, I felt that Parliament had to be sovereign in all decision making. So I was part of the group of people that argued it on a sovereignty issue. As someone who is an immigrant, which I am, and which I've had 3 generations of immigrants in my family who've gone from one country to another country to another country, obviously I think immigration is very good. What I did support, though, was this point system, where the point system would identify where the demand... Just a second.
No. Oh, you're banging the desk.
Sorry. Okay, where the point system was good because it would identify where there was a need for particular types of workers. The only other caveat I would have to that argument, which I made, which is that if you went to one of the top 100 universities in the world and you wanted to come to Britain, please come. They're not coming here for the benefits. They're coming here to make a contribution to our society. But the caveat would be you don't have the benefits for a minimum of 5 years or some sort of reasonable period of time to see that you've actually made a contribution to society.
What sovereignty did we not have? I still have never heard anyone on that. You don't want to repeat Brexit.
We're not going to refight. We're really not going to refight Brexit, because I want to squeeze in Jane in Bromsgrove's text question. Theresa May is leading the rebellion against Suella Braverman's cruel law against migrants this evening. Will history be a lot kinder to her than we might have thought in 2019? John Crace. As someone who's always kind to her.
Yes, as the person who christened her the Maybot, I'm afraid that sort of history has... I think it will be kinder to her. I mean, I kind of look at her in Parliament nowadays with a sort of sense of nostalgia. I thought she was the worst we would get. But now she's looking like a kind of vision of sanity. It's extraordinary. Politics comes at you fast these days.
Certainly does. Brooks?
I think in terms of the way history, the Conservative Party, I'm afraid, will not look back necessarily kindly on her. I think historians will, though, and I think an objective, more balanced approach, perhaps looking back 30 years from now, she will be looked at much better, in the same way probably David Cameron will be as well, who ended up being quite divisive in my party.
Liz Truss?
Liz Truss, it's too short a period for me to comment.
Alys?
I certainly think her post-prime ministerial career has been a lot more dignified than certainly that of Boris Johnson. And I think, it's always good to have people with that kind of expertise on the backbenches in Parliament.
Zack?
I think someone who's had the top job and then sits on the backbenches and does that with the kind of diligence that she does it, that's to be respected. At the same time, she created the hostile environment, and I think for that she should never be remembered kindly.
Right, our fun question from Lynn in Morecambe. Apparently today is World Emoji Day. What would the panel say is their most used emoji? Zack?
Green love heart, both for my colleagues and my boyfriend. It's multi-purpose.
See, I was going to say a red heart, because that's a lazy person. So if somebody texts something nice to me or does it on Twitter, instead of sort of saying, well, thank you so much, that's really kind, I just do a red heart. Alys?
I think it depends who I'm texting. So with my work colleagues, when we're trying to talk about the government and policies we're trying to get across, it's mostly the smiley poo emoji. And with my friends, it's usually the cry laughing.
Brooks?
I tend to get quite a lot of messages from some people, and I tend to shorten the conversation by simply putting a thumbs up. It just cuts down.
A lot of people do that.
It cuts the...
really annoys me.
Well, otherwise you end up having long back and forth conversation. It's a great way to actually cut a conversation off without being rude.
John Crace?
I'm afraid I am so old and so dull that I make a virtue of never ever using an emoji in anything.
I thought you were going to say, I don't know what an emoji is. Is it a popular music beat combo you're on?
I'm not quite there.
Listen, thank you all very much indeed for being with us today. Zack Polanski, Brooks Newmark, Alys Denby and John Crace. Coming up in the next hour, do you know what today is? Do you know what today is, Zack?
Yes, it's 10 years since same-sex marriage.
You win the quiz, and that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking to Lynn Featherstone, who was the Liberal Democrat minister who was the driving force behind equal marriage 10 years ago. The bill got its royal assent today 10 years ago, and I want to ask you two questions. If you were opposed to equal marriage at the time, have you changed your mind? Because I suspect